If you could ask God a question, what would it be? As we get older and we study, we get a lot of our questions answered to a certain degree of satisfaction anyway. But then there are those other questions that if God was in front of us, that we would love to ask him. These questions that I don't think that anybody humanly possible is going to be able to answer them, not at least without the help of God. Well, Habakkuk has the opportunity to ask God one of the biggest questions in life. This is a question that not even the Pope understands it, and he's admitted that he does not have the answer to it. Well, Habakkuk has this opportunity, and he continues to quiz God, and God answers him. So today we're going to begin this look into the book of Habakkuk and see how God answers this question for him and subsequently for us. Now, a little background first. Little is known about Habakkuk. And what we can surmise, I would say, is sketchy at best. His name, as we normally go into, means to embrace, or similarly, wrestler, or somebody who wrestles with God. And we might see how this is apropos, both of these, as he continues to have this tete-a-tete, as it were, with God about these questions. So he goes through this conversation, and it's this back and forth, and he comes before God in a manner that I think a lot of people might not be comfortable with, but we have this example that if you approach God in the right way, that we can ask these things of God, and he has no problem answering it. So, continuing with the background, Habakkuk identifies himself as a prophet. We'll see that in verse 1 of the first chapter. But outside of that, we don't know much about him. This is the only place, he's the only Habakkuk. And again, I'll try to say it the way that I think Strong says it's to be pronounced, but I think a lot of us will say Habakkuk, and I don't want to get caught up necessarily in that. But either way, I'm sure God will understand, especially this was written in a foreign tongue, and then it's transliterated to our English letters and whatnot. So the other thing that some people believe is that he may have been a Levite or a priest. But suffice it to say, less is known about him than any other author in the Bible. Now, this book is ostensibly to Judah, but Judah is not mentioned by name, though it's obvious by the timing. And I think the fact that Judah is not mentioned makes the fact that prophecy is dual, it has a duality to its nature, makes it a little bit easier for it to be understood in that way, that it not only applies to the time immediately following this vision that was given to him and then subsequently to the people of Judah, but also for the future to Israel as well. So Israel and Judah are going to be at the mercy of the final revival of the Babylonian Empire. So this applies to our time too, and the fact that the godlessness that was abounding then abounds now. Now, we see that this book here is placed, at this point in juncture in the Bible because of when they believe it was written. Best that anyone can tell, and we'll give a fairly broad range of somewhere between 609 BC to 597 BC. So you put it in the middle, do give or take, 5 years. We don't have any type of year of reference for a king instance. A lot of other books will say, in such and such year of this king. But what we do see here is that judgment on Judah appears to be in the future. And we see that the temple is still standing. So those give us some clues here. So it proceeds there going into captivity. And we also see that the type of sins that Habakkuk is addressing is not in line with the more righteous reign of Josiah. Josiah had lived, and we'll address that in just a little bit later, but he was one of the better kings, if not the best king, of Judah around that time. But it's more appropriate to the reign of some of the subsequent kings who had led the people back into sin and carnality. And also we will see that the way that the Chaldeans are spoken of is that they're already in power, and they are known to be this bellicose and heinous peoples that has a reputation that has already gotten back to the people of Judah. So they understood that they would not more than likely be able to withstand against the Chaldean forces. So they seem to have this intimate knowledge of this Babylonian brutality and their way of fighting that we'll see here a little bit later. So we see that Habakkuk is this contemporary of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and it's situated right here between the books of Nahum and Zephaniah, who are also contemporaries with Habakkuk. And I always kind of find that a little bit interesting that sometimes we segregate these prophets out and look at them in a standalone basis, but they were going on and prophesying at the same time as each other. So God saw it fit to make sure that the people of Judah, and prior to that, of Israel, were warned, that they were told the way that they were needing to be and what would happen if they were not. So what we have then going on at this time in Judah, and again, you can look at and put this in your notes, 2 Kings 23, and go, say, verses 29 to 37, at just how things had made a turn since Josiah. I'll just kind of sum it up here, but what happened is that Pharaoh Necho, of the king of Egypt, was going up to help out Assyria against Babylon or the Chaldeans. Well, Josiah decided to get in his way, and he was killed by Pharaoh Necho. So after that, when the body of Josiah was brought back to Jerusalem, the people then took Jehoahaz, who was the son of Josiah. They anointed him and made him king after the father had died. Well, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, as we'll hear that phrase over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Well, Pharaoh Necho put him in prison, and he set up Eliakim and changed his name to Jehoiakim. And so this was another son of Josiah who he put in place there in Jerusalem. So Jehoiakim then paid Pharaoh, his tribute, the taxes and whatnot. And then finally in verse 37, and it said, speaking of Jehoiakim, he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all his fathers had done. So then I think Jehoiakim died as the Babylonians were marching towards Jerusalem, and Jehoiakim, so Jehoiakim, and then Jehoiakim, his son, came up, and he was the next king, and I think he reigned for about 3 months. And then it was also said of him that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. So this is what the situation is. This is the way that everything stands now at the time of Habakkuk and the prophecy that he saw that was given to him, and what's coming out of him, and why he is saying the things that he is about to say, and ask the questions that he is about to ask. So let's go to Habakkuk. Again, they say it's based on a Hebrew word. There's actually some differentiation where they're not even sure that Habakkuk is a Hebrew name. So again, forgive me for switching back and forth. I'm trying to say it correctly. But in Habakkuk 1, verse 1, it says, the burden which the prophet saw. Okay, and that's it. So this is kind of what we have in terms of Habakkuk talking about himself. But we see here that it's a vision. Chapter 2, verse 3 confirms this as well. So we have a vision from God. It's not Habakkuk's own words here. And he talks about the burden of it. And we've seen this word used in the same exact way by other minor prophets, interestingly enough. I think we talked about Nahum, Zechariah, Malachi, who also considered the burden, the word that they were given, the visions that they were given, a burden. So again, it's this heaviness of responsibility and the impactful nature of this prophecy, which has to be said. And again, it's a relatively short book. So it's compacted. Isaiah, Jeremiah, they all had a lot more time to say the things that they were going to say and fill in the stuff in between and whatnot. But in these books, he had to get straight to the point. And so, again, he considered it a burden, as I think many of us would, especially when we understand what the message is that we would have to go give to the people. So verse 2, he begins with his questions. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. So again, we have this approach. Kind of reminds me of Hebrews 4:16, where Paul's saying there, let us come boldly before the throne of grace. Right? This is, to me, how he was going towards God. And some people don't think that this is okay, that you should ever, question anything that God does. And again, what we see is Habakkuk goes through and does it in the right way. He's not saying, God, you're wrong, explain this to me better or anything like that. He's saying, basically, help me to understand what it is that you're saying here, because this is what I'm thinking. Okay, so correct me, show me, because I don't understand this. And so here we are, we're going to get into these bigger questions. That here he is, again, we're assuming that he was well trained and he understood, and we definitely know that God's using him as a prophet and giving him these insights. And yet this is his state here. So he's talking about the violence that's going on. He said, look at what's going on around me. And again, we went through that little bit of section there in 2 Kings that talked about just how things were beginning to transpire and what was happening in the land. So verse 3, why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. So he goes, why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? He's referring to the vision. He's saying, okay, I know that you've given me this vision about these things that are going to come to pass, but why do you need to show me that when all you have to do is look around and see what's going on here? So we've already seen, from before, and also in our studies of Zephaniah, which is one of Habakkuk's contemporaries, that Judah was already going off the track. In Zephaniah 3 and verse 4, it says, her prophets are insolent, treacherous people. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. All right, so the same exact word that we're talking about here in verses 2 and 3 in Habakkuk. And we see here that the leaders have violated the law. They've broken, they transgressed it. They've been adding to and taking away from the law of God, which, again, of course, he does not look upon very kindly. And as the leaders go and the teachers go, so go the people. So we have here, as Habakkuk is looking around at society in Judah and sees, look, they're not following your ways. They are doing violence. And so, again, why do I need to see all this other stuff? Why is it that this is happening here and this is not being taken care of? Why is this continuing to be allowed? And he sees the effects of it. Now in verse 4, he says, therefore, the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgment proceeds. Again, it brings to mind Ecclesiastes 8:11. It says, because the sentence against evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. So Habakkuk here is saying, look, the law is powerless. The King James Version says slacked. Other versions use paralyzed or not enforced. So what we're seeing here is that it only works, the law only works when it is kept. If it was being followed, then many of the problems of their day wouldn't have existed. Yet Habakkuk is bemoaning the fact that there is no truth, no justice. Even those that are good, quote unquote, are unduly influenced by the evil that is in their midst. Again, this is appropriate not only for then, but for today. We're talking about the duality of the nature of prophecy, that it will have and can have two fulfillments. So the one that was immediately following this vision given to Habakkuk, and then one further in the future that I hope to talk about in more detail later. But what we're seeing here then is that back then, those may have been trying to do good, were not able to succeed because of the perversity of those around them. And if we look at what's going on today in America, say politically speaking, do you think that a truly religious man could get into office without being vilified? I mean, this is in direct contravention to the way that most, if not the majority of them, believe. So even now we look there are some that are trying to be somewhat religious. But what we also see is that those who are not religious hold the quasi-religious to those standards and vilify them for things that they don't even try to believe or try to live by. So they take their rules and use it against the religious so that it handcuffs them and they're not able to do the things. And of course, their idea is to stay in power, to keep promoting and promulgating their ways and get these other people out. So yeah, they're going to come down hard, and the religious are not allowed, as it were, to be religious for one reason or the other. And so they become then vilified. And what happens? Well, evil continues. People continue to follow them in the wrong direction. And it will have an end to it. But nonetheless, Habakkuk sees all the violence, the oppression, the injustice, the wrongdoing. And again, you can transcribe that to that time as well as what's going on right now, the violence, the oppression, the injustice, and the wrongdoing in Judah, okay, and in the future in all of Israel and Judah. Again, we've talked about at length who modern day Israel is and modern day Judah. And that is the United States and British Commonwealth in prophecy, as well as the people of Israel and other parts of Europe where the lost 10 tribes went to after Assyrian captivity. So in all of this, though, okay, Habakkuk is seeing this, and he wonders why God is hands off. Okay, this is one of the first and biggest questions that believers and non-believers alike have. Now, non-believers will say, if there is a God, why does he allow evil to reign? As if this is some type of proof that God does not exist. And believers look at their own lot in life and compare it with others and ask, why does God not take care of or punish the wicked, but rather allows them to succeed and prosper? So we look around, and the believer says, okay, well, I look at people in the world, I look at people in the church, and some of them are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're allowed to continue doing those things. And the non-believer is going to look back, if not now, but throughout the rest of history, and say, if God is all powerful, and I think by definition, most people understand God to be all powerful and omniscient and even omnipresent, then why is he not doing anything? Why have the atrocities of the past and present been allowed to occur, or why have they occurred if God is that way? And their supposition and conclusion is that God does not exist. And so even that becomes a stumbling block for them as they move forward, and if they were to begin to believe that there was a God. This then hampers that effort, and they go, yeah, I don't see God. And that's because they've gone through and defined God. Okay, they've, in this sense, created God in their own mind, as opposed to the reverse, that they look at him as being all-powerful, all-knowing, and he created us. And that he is the greater being, outside of space and time, that made us and knows what he's doing. So what we're going to find here now is that we don't necessarily have to wait until the return of Christ to answer some of the bigger questions in life. And it doesn't have to be like we're looking through a tinted window into the mind of God. But God, if we are diligent and we put a little bit here and a little bit there together, that we can come to these answers. And here we have, again, Habakkuk, this small, relatively small book in what we call the minor prophets, because they're all small books that most people won't open. And yet it has the answers to some of the biggest questions of life. We have to have the smaller questions answered so that we can keep building on them and move forward. But here it is, the answer to, what is God doing? Why is evil allowed? Why does it prosper? Why are the seemingly good people, the quote unquote righteous people, suffering and not allowed to prevail? Well, let's begin looking at God's reply. So in verse 5 of the first chapter of Habakkuk, it says, "Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe though it were told you." So again, what we're seeing here is, and he was given this vision, that the Chaldeans were going to be brought against the Jews for a prescribed amount of time, and that then the people of Judah would be punished for their evil ways. Okay, this is what he was saying. He said, okay, this violence abounds around me. Why is it allowed to continue? So guys, well, I am going to take care of it. It's just not when you think that I should take care of it. Okay? Because a lot of people, I think, when they look at God, they see him as juggling one ball. Because we, in our own limited scope and mind and capability and knowledge, that's kind of about where we are. We see this and we don't see the effects that this has on something else, or that it'll have on down the road on something else that God's working out, or that he's got these externalities that are coming into view that we don't see yet, but that are going to accomplish something based on this and that and the other thing. So yeah, God's not juggling one ball. He's got a whole bunch of things that have been going on since before the history of man. They're presently being accomplished, and things that are still yet to happen in the future. So he's saying, okay, just step back for a second and understand this. So he's saying that in your days, though it were told to you. So again, God's speaking to the Jews of that time through Habakkuk, right? If you want, you can turn back to Jeremiah 5, just 11 through 13. And just want to reiterate what Jeremiah was saying and what he said many times and what other prophets said many times. And if you were empathetic, you can imagine the exasperation of these people, the prophets, that they had to be patient and long-suffering and continue to listen to themselves say the same thing over and over, perhaps kind of like our parents do. And maybe we can have a little bit more empathy for God too, as he is the one that's the author of these things, that he's the one that's saying these things. But Jeremiah 5, verses 11 through 13, it says, "For the house of Israel and the house of Judah have dealt very treacherously with me, says the Lord. They have lied about the Lord and said, it is not he." Okay, so whenever Jeremiah, Isaiah, any of the prophets bring the word, They're going, okay, yeah, no, that's not what God's really saying. And, who are you to speak for God? And they'll come up with their own excuses. And here, even though Jeremiah is telling them exactly what's going to happen, and Habakkuk will as well, they say, neither will evil come upon us, nor shall we see sword or famine. So God's going to bring the Chaldeans, this is what Habakkuk is saying, and he's going to bring it against Judah at this time. And people willfully ignore and say, no, that's not what's going to happen. He says, these things are not going to come to pass. The sword, the violence, the war, the famine that normally follows. And he says in verse 13, and the prophets become wind, for the word is not in them. Thus shall it be done to them. So again, it's like talking the words in the wind, and they're just being carried off to points beyond and not landing on fertile ground on people's ears and hearts and minds. This has been the case all the time. So he's saying, okay, though it were told to you, you would not believe this. So why would they believe God now when they were actively disobeying? They weren't following the other things he told them. They're not going to follow the things that he's telling them now. Perhaps they reasoned in their mind that they thought that the Chaldeans were going to be friendly to them because of what Josiah had done. When we talked about that before, he was trying to intervene, and he was trying to help the Babylonians in their onslaught and the battles that they were having with the Assyrians when the Egyptians were coming to their aid. Who knows what was going through their minds, because people can be their own greatest deceivers. We are masters of self-delusion when we want to justify the things that we want to justify when a prophet comes into our midst. Look, to put it in modern terms, okay, we look back on this and we look at the Bible as the Word of God. We know that these men were prophets. We know that what they were saying was true. We know that prophecy came to pass, and it came upon the people just as God told them through these prophets. But if you want to put yourself in their place at that time, let's just look at modern times. We're saying nearly the exact same thing today. This is a message that the Church of God has put out for the last 80 plus years. And it's this. Okay, listen to this now. The final revival of the Babylonian system is coming in the form of the beast power. And we as a society need to change our ways and begin following God like we're supposed to. How is that message being received by the world today? Hopefully that puts it in a little better perspective. We're saying the same thing that Habakkuk was saying. We're saying that, okay, look at all the stuff that's going on around. We are descending into this carnal degradation. We're following the evil ways of Satan, society. And the resounding word of God that's going out, okay, in this final trumpeting message is saying, repent. Again, as soon as people say that, they roll their eyes and, give some kind of guffaw and walk their way. And you say, look, this Babylonian system, which has always existed, okay, the system of Satan, is coming again in this final time, this 10th resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. How crazy does that sound? How many people are heeding that call, those words? Well, so perhaps we shouldn't be too harsh on the people of Judah back in that time, because here we are, the descendants of Israel and Judah, being told the same exact thing, and these things will come to pass. So we're starting to see the duality of this prophecy. So even, and it's not just then and now, it's been the case throughout the history of man. In fact, In Acts 13, verses 40 and 41, this verse here is being quoted. It says, "Beware therefore lest what has been spoken in the prophet come upon you. Behold, you despisers marvel and perish. For I work a work in your days, a work which you will by no means believe, though one were to declare it to you." So we can say that now. You wouldn't believe it, and they don't, and they won't. And subsequently, they will perish. But then they will know, to a large degree, that after it has come to pass, that these words were true. Which, again, sometimes you kind of go say, duh, but even then, it's not always evident to them until someone tells them. So then here in verse 6, he lets us in of Habakkuk, verse 6 of chapter 1, on who it is that's going to be the instrument of his punishment. Again, we've been talking about this like we knew because, again, it's hard to let it be a surprise when we've talked about the Jews going into captivity so many times before. But that kind of helps us to see what's going on. But here we have in verse 6, and it's the only place in this whole book that it's named. He says, "For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs." So again, for this case and the sake of timing that we're seeing, this is not necessarily the beginning of their empire, where he's raising them up to be the great empire that they were, this head of gold that's mentioned in the image of Daniel. It is that too, but here he is now orchestrating things, okay? He's raising them up to the point where they're going to come against you, Judah. So we see then that, okay, again, they went into captivity and was this 70 years as a punishment for their ways. And already at this time, it's known that they were this bitter and hasty nation. They were this fierce and cruel and impetuous type of country in the way that they approached war, which now marches across the earth to become this world-ruling empire, and anything that stood in their way was conquered. Now, what we have here, though, is that God is answering the question that Habakkuk had asked before. Now, here's the problem, is that I don't think that this is the answer that he wanted, and now he may wish that he had not asked it, though God would have done it anyway. God is going to use the Chaldeans to subjugate the Jews for the violence that Habakkuk was referring to in the very beginning verses of this chapter. And so it was later fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar, while at the same time being this antitype of what's going to be happening at the very end of the age, yet in the future for us. So these things were in the future for Judah. They have now come to pass some, over 2,500 years ago. And it will have another fulfillment yet in the future from now, and I don't think in the very far future. Verse 7, "They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from them." They are this fearsome and frightening war machine, and they are a law unto themselves. They're making up laws and rules and having their own sense of honor. Perhaps we would say honor among thieves, right? They can have some type of dichotomy of rules where it applies in one way for these people, but not for them. So they have this reputation already. They're this prideful people that are inclined to drinking too much. They're barbarous. They've committed these atrocities against their enemies. And now they're coming for the nation of Judah. And again, it further describes them in verses 8 and 9. It says, "Their horses are also swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves." And again, I don't know why it is I was never as afraid of wolves as I am now. Again, more fearful of them because they're much bigger, I think, than I've always imagined. Also, they run in packs and they're inclined to be very ferocious and taking on, many manner of different animals and beasts. So we have them fast, they're fierce, their chargers charge ahead, their cavalry comes from afar, they fly as an eagle that hastens to eat, that swoops down on its prey. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind, and they gather captives like sand. So they're going to be this overwhelming force that you will not be able to resist, and they will defeat you and take you into captivity. Again, you would not believe these things though they were told. They did not believe them then, and now same thing is true. You can tell them that they're coming. People don't believe that America could go into captivity. I think it's, if they're, honest, and they look at the direction that the country is going now, that perhaps they can see the end, the demise of this empire. No empire lasts forever, except the kingdom of God, when it comes, and it will be established over all the nations, and then it will indeed rule forever. But until then, the nations of men will sooner or later come to naught. Even the Babylonian Empire, and the Greco-Macedonian Empire, and the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Roman Empire, which again will have another final resurrection, the one that we've been talking about. But the people, back to the point of America and United Kingdom and whatnot, do not believe, do not see the handwriting on the wall. They do not see that the nation can come to naught, because we continue to say, we're number one, and that we're going to be great again. But we don't get to be great again just for the sake of being great again. There is cause and effect. And right now, as a people, we're not living the godly way. And because of this, even if you don't want to believe it or not, even though you're being told, there's going to be a captivity in addition to the sword coming against the land and people being killed and being scattered and then dying from the disease and famine and pestilence that ensues. Continuing in verse 10, they, being the Chaldeans, scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. So they will not respect the powers that be. They'll make fun of them, ridicule, and laugh at them. And the connotation here is even making sport of the people that they attack. In 2 Kings 24, and I'll just read a couple verses for you. You don't need to turn there because we'll go to 25 as well. But 2 Kings 24, verse 12, again, it shows what they did. Jehoiakim, right, remember, king of Judah, and his mother, his servants, his princes, his officers went out to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon, in the 8th year of his reign, took him prisoner. So again, we see this fulfillment of this happening. And then 25 verse 6 and 7, they took the king and brought him up, the king of Babylon, at Riblah, and they pronounced judgment on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, so that the last thing he saw were his sons, the princes, being killed. And they bound him in bronze fetters and took him to Babylon. So again, they did end up doing this. Okay. And there's going to, again, in the future, be a fulfillment of that as well. But they had this disdain for all of these people, the nobles, the elders, the men who sat in positions of prominence, and they took them all down without respect. So you can go back and you can look at, 2 Kings 24 and 25, the story about Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim when he reigns in Judah and Jerusalem being captured. But he talked about then that they're going to heap up these earthen mounds and seize it. And I think we may have seen different things like that in history where they build up the dirt to overtake it. In Jeremiah 32 and verse 24, it talks about the siege mounds. They have come to the city to take it. The city has been given into the hand of the Chaldeans who fight against it because of the sword and famine and pestilence. What you have spoken of has happened. There you see it. So there it is. In retrospect now that these things have happened, he says, look, this has happened. Just like, God told Habakkuk that it would happen. So yes, we see God making these things come to pass on the Jews at that time for the sins that they had committed. Then in verse 11, it says, then, again, talking about the Chaldeans here, then his mind changes, he transgresses, he commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So he begins to think of himself a little more highly than he should. So the word here for mind, interestingly enough, is ruach, which is the word for spirit. It's mostly translated as spirit, but it can be translated as wind as well. Again, this gives us, kind of this description, as it were, of what the Spirit of God, the power of God is and like. But what I want to draw your attention to is that it says, then his mind changes, his spirit changes. Now, some people point to Daniel. We'll look at a few verses over there if you want to go ahead and turn there. Daniel 4, verse 16. So some people point to this, and again, it seems to make a pretty good case for it, and we'll look at that just a little more in depth here. For what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, okay, that his mind changed, his spirit changed. In Daniel 4 and verse 16, it says, let this heart be changed from that of a man, let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. So for 7 years, God was going to pronounce this judgment on Nebuchadnezzar for the way that he acted. I'm skipping down to verse 30. It says, the king spoke and says, is not this great Babylon that I built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? So this is what we're talking about here, is that God is the one that raised up Chaldeans, Babylonians, to come against his people. It is God is the one that's in charge. It is God that is working things out. But here it is, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I did this. And while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. So we see then that his spirit is changed from the spirit of man to the spirit of a beast. He became like an animal. And again, we've talked about that at length in a message about the spirit in man. And we see that the difference, and we see readily the difference between man and animals. And they shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times the 7 years will pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules, okay, it's God that's doing this, in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses. God is the one that's in charge, that is orchestrating these things. Verse 33, that very hour the word was fulfilled, again, because God has the power to do these things, concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men. He ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. And at the end of the time, here's the summation of it, verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So that was a hard lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had to go through, and a long one, 7 years of doing that. But He got the point across, and it was in God's time, because God's the one in control. Now, we came here looking at this because what we're looking for in verse 11 says, then his mind changes, right? So definitely this change of spirit, okay, the spirit of man to a spirit of beast, and even began reflecting it physically. But yet Nebuchadnezzar was made aware to one degree or another what was going on, what had happened. And God even saved his kingdom for him for 7 years, that he would take back that throne, showing the power of God. And perhaps, if we can try to interject a little bit, our own thoughts and suppositions, you go, well, what were other people thinking of at that time? Were they thinking that, that there is no God, that these things can just happen? Or, over time, did they come to see these things? And was, the reality of God and who and what he was made even more clear? Anyway, so verse 11 says, then his mind changes and he transgresses. So if both of those phrases there are talking about, and it goes on, he commits offense as well, ascribing this power to his God. If it's talking about one person, then this doesn't make the most sense. And it actually makes more sense, though we don't have this whole mind-changing part in Daniel 5, where it's actually been given to us to see, okay, he was once this way, but now he's another way. Or perhaps it's talking about two people. But in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 4, it talks about Belshazzar, okay, who's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He's a king, and he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple. Okay, this is the temple of the Jews here, and which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that they had taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and they drank from them. Verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood and stone. So we see then that perhaps this fits more likely into verse 11. All right. We see this transition. This is what the main point of verse 11 is, this transition from the Chaldeans being this instrument of God to them thinking of themselves a little more highly than they ought. And we see then that his mind changes, perhaps at one time. And again, this is why we have to say perhaps and say, okay, well, the Bible doesn't tell us necessarily that Belshazzar had a different mind like his father. Perhaps he did, and could have been very likely that he did, considering that Nebuchadnezzar had this change of heart. Right, and said this, and so now he passed this on to his son, and he made it very clear to his son. But then he's drinking, and he's doing it with the temple vessels, and he praised the gods of gold and silver, which are not gods. And then what happens in verse 30? That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, after he literally saw the writing on the wall, which is no doubt where we get that saying from. It came up, many tekel upharsin, and his life was required of him that night. And so, again, we see in one way or the other that the Chaldeans then, in verse 11, committed this offense, transgressed, their mind changed, and they ascribed their power to a God which was not a God, with a little g, G-O-D. So we have then God using them to them then thinking that they are bigger than they are, that they're the big wigs and these problems. And then what happens? When they commit these offenses, that God then executes judgment. One way on Nebuchadnezzar and another way on Belshazzar. But in the end, Habakkuk's initial question was answered. That no, the sinner is not going to win out in the long run. You're looking at it a little too myopically, Habakkuk. You are looking at it and saying, oh, why is this not happening right now on my timetable? Well, here's your answer. It's going to happen. I showed you what's going to come to pass. Don't worry. I've got this. I'm in charge. So then, now the guy showed him what's going to happen. He's got a second question. So verse 12, or I should say second sets of questions, because he has a lot there that he's compacting into the initial verses and now these. He goes, are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. So I think he's saying these things more rhetorically. He says, are you not from everlasting? You are all powerful. He's saying, we shall not die. In that sense, he's saying, do not let them kill us, because we know the way that the Chaldeans are. So, verse 13, he says, you are of purer eyes. So he begins to describe God, than to behold evil, in the way he sees it anyway, and cannot look on wickedness. Perhaps that refers back to some of the writings of Isaiah, that he removes himself from us when we sin. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, speaking of the Chaldeans, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Speaking of the Jews. So he says, how is it that you can look on these people who are more evil? I know that what we're doing is bad, but what these guys are doing is far worse. How is it then that you're using somebody who is less righteous than us to come and tell us, or to come and pronounce judgment on us? So to me, this is really the same question that he had before, just from a different perspective. So first, why do you let your people get away with murder? It was kind of the first question. Why do you let them continue to sin and keep on going the way that they're going, and allow sin to continue? So he answered that. Now he's asking, why do you let an evil nation that is not your people, get away with even worse? And then you let them correct us, your people. Are they not greater sinners than we are? You're a holy God. They're an evil people. How can you even associate with them? I'm just not getting this. I'm not understanding this. Habakkuk says to God, in other words. He says, why do you make men like fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? So we're getting into these metaphors for the impending captivity, and how impotent this southern kingdom of Judah will be against the onslaught of these Babylonians. Verse 15, they take up all of them with a hook. They catch them in their net. They gather them in their dragnet. They therefore rejoice and are glad. So the ignominy and the humiliation of it all seems somewhat haphazard. The Babylonians they're throwing their net everywhere, and they're pulling in fish, meaning your people, and they're doing it indiscriminately. They're happy about it. They don't, to a large degree, care. And to a certain degree, a lot of them don't even realize that you're using them to punish us. And it's so bad that, verse 16, that they sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet, because their snare is sumptuous and their food is plentiful. So again, we're seeing this transition, this mind change, as we were talking about. The Chaldeans believe at this point that it's by their gods that they conquer the Jews. They're going to make these sacrifices to these gods made of sticks and fibers and whatever they may have been using at the time to make their nets. Why, God, do you allow such an ungodly group of people to do this? Shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? So how is it that God can use these to judge his nation when they're acting in a way that seems contrary to it? Look, we had judges. We know how judges are supposed to judge and what they're supposed to do, and that it comes from you, and often very supernaturally. But we have to remember the lesson, even the lesson from the previous part of the chapter, is that God is in control. No matter what we think and see, over time and in ways that we do not understand, God is intimately involved. Perhaps some see it as apathy and disinterest, but that's just because of their own ignorance and their lowly state, can I say. I mean, we are a vapor. We're less than nothing. And yet we're looking up to this omniscient, omnipotent God, and we're judging him by us. The reality is, Isaiah 55, in fact, let me turn over there. Isaiah 55 verses 8 through 11. We have to realize and keep in perspective the difference between us and God. We often judge God and we make him in our image. And it's the other way around. We are trying to become like God. And yet we're trying to make God like us. And so we look at it with this limited view. But we have to understand, as Isaiah says in verse 8 of chapter 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain comes down and the snow from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth and make it bring forth bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper in the thing for which I sent it." So this is the message of Habakkuk here, is that I'm doing these things. I know why I'm doing. You don't completely understand or see them, but it is accomplishing exactly what I want it to accomplish. Okay? And if you will wait, you will see. So God told Habakkuk beforehand what was going to happen. Now, the Babylonians thought that they did it. So even though the Babylonians did not believe, or even to a large degree, his own people did not believe, at least they were told it. And afterwards, after it happened, then they would know. And they did know after 70 years in captivity. It changed them greatly because of what God had done. So there's this plan that's being worked out here below. If you understood it, and we do to a large degree, compared to the unbeliever anyway, but it's still obscure to us. And it's only in a small measure as compared to what God knows and what he's doing. And what may seem like chaos to us is a plan that God has been orchestrating. He put it in motion from before the world began. And what's going on now, back then, now if we want to transition our thoughts to what's going on in Habakkuk's time, it's not happenstance. It's occurring at the time and in the way that God ordained it. Let's go to one last set of scriptures in 2 Peter 3 and verse 2 through 13. 2 Peter 3, verses 2 through 13. Peter says, "That you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets." Again, it had been good for the people of Judah to have heeded this and taken it into account at the time, but it behooves us now, even more so, to be mindful of the words spoken by the prophets and of the commandments of us and the apostles, the Lord and the Savior, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust. Again, we're talking about these scoffers that are going to say these things. They're going to be these evil people going to say whatever they want to say because it suits them. And they're off in their pursuit of their own worldly goods. And he says, verse 4, saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. It seems that mankind continues to go exactly the same way that he's always been going. So I don't see any proof that God's working anything out here. Not since the beginning of time. This is exactly what the non-believers and some of the believers are saying. Verse 5, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So again, Adam existed. He passed the word down. Noah existed. He continued to pass the word down. But we are willfully ignorant of those things and say we don't, have to believe those things. Those are fairy tales, or that God's not going to do these things to us. It's exactly what's going on now. Verse 7, but the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men. So again, there is going to be a judgment. This is what God's saying. By the same word that all these other things have happened in the past, by the same word that I'm giving to Habakkuk here, that there's going to be this day of judgment on all ungodly men. So the Jews are going to get their, what they deserve, okay, as well as everybody else. So verse 8, but beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. So again, this is all a very short time to God. Now it seems very long to us, but he's accomplishing these things in his time. All right? So we look at it from such a short perspective. This is not that long of a time for God, and he is accomplishing these things. There's a patience that we need to have. But he says the Lord is not slack concerning his promise. So we talked about, them being slacked before. He says God's not slack. He's going to keep his word, his law. As some count slackness, but is long suffering toward us. Again, I can just imagine him up there just, shaking his head sometimes. Look, I'm telling you what's going to happen. Why do you not believe me? But he's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. The elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in will be burned up. Everything physical is going to eventually disappear. I'm telling you what's going to happen, Habakkuk. I'm telling you, modern day Israel and Judah, what's going to happen. I'm telling you, people of America and the United Kingdom and the rest of the world, what's going to happen. And what's going to be the end of these things, whether you believe it or not. Therefore, verse 11, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? If judgment is going to come upon all ungodly men, then by implication, we should be godly. We should have holy conduct. And looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, the elements will melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Okay, that's the kind of person that we want to be, so that we will be with him in the end. Otherwise, Jews and everybody else, God is not slack concerning his promises, concerning his prophecies, concerning the things that he said will come to pass. So we are to continue acting that way. And we're to stand and see the salvation of the Lord. This is what Moses said to the Israelites as they were hemmed in between the mountain ranges up against the Red Sea. Stand and see the salvation of the Lord. It's what Samuel told the Israelites when they forsook God for a human king. stand and see the salvation of the Lord. It's what King Jehoshaphat told the powerless people of Judah when the great multitudes were coming against them. And it's what Habakkuk opted to do as well. In chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I'm corrected.